Lorraine told me I wasn't welcome right there at the country club banquet table, bourbon in the air, and silverware frozen mid-clink. I am Malcolm Greer, 48, an internal controller who left with nothing but a steady breath and my old ceramic cup, still unchipped. Ever walked away calm while knowing the real storm hadn't started yet? The hum of polite chatter at the Lexington Country Club dulled to a brittle silence as Lorraine leaned forward across the glossy banquet table. Her voice cut through the soft clinking of cutlery, each word flattened like a ledger line. "You're not welcome here." No preface, no hesitation, just the sentence clean and cold, as if she were auditing my worth in real time. The bourbon-sweet air from the bar seemed sharper all of a sudden, prickling the back of my throat. I set my fork down beside a half-eaten rib, glanced at the crimson edge of its bone, and wondered briefly if my father would have flinched at hearing his children talk to each other like this. My hand drifted to the inside pocket of my jacket. I could feel the corner of the envelope, heavy cream-colored, still carrying the faint scent of my father's cologne from years ago. The original pension trust contract, the one no one at this table even remembers exists. I didn't pull it out. I didn't need to. Just the feel of it steadied me, a silent reminder that I had something real, something they hadn't buried under meetings and toasts and family theater. Lorraine's eyes flicked to my hand, then back to my face. But she didn't ask. She thought I was fidgeting, maybe nervous. She couldn't be more wrong. I looked down the table at the rest of them, cousins, aunts, even a nephew or two who'd been born after the last time this family actually felt like a family. Not a single one raised their eyes. Their utensils hovered midair, unsure if it was more polite to chew or wait for someone to announce a truce. I gave them none. Instead, I reached for my water, sipped, and let the coolness wash over the sting in my mouth. The bourbon aroma, the slow burn of smoked brisket, the faint scrape of a chair leg against polished wood. Every detail seemed sharper, like my senses wanted me to record this moment in high definition. Lorraine leaned back, folding her manicured hands in her lap, wearing the kind of satisfied smirk that people in this family seem to inherit more easily than integrity. "It's nothing personal," she added, though we both knew it was nothing but personal. I pushed my chair back, its legs sighing against the hardwood, and stood without a word. My steak cooled on the plate, a thin wisp of steam fading into the air. Not one person moved to stop me. Maybe they were relieved. Maybe they were afraid of picking a side. I didn't care enough to know. As I walked toward the door, the room seemed to exhale behind me. My reflection caught in the glass pane just as I reached for the handleback, straight shoulders squared, the kind of posture I used to have to practice in front of mirrors before presentations. I held the gaze of that reflection for a beat, taking in the calm lines of my face. I wasn't angry, not exactly. Anger is loud. This was something quieter, heavier. Like a locked vault nobody remembers the combination to, but me. The handle was cool against my palm. The door swung open with a soft hiss, and the warm murmur of bourbon and barbecue was replaced by a crisp autumn wind. The smell of oak leaves and the distant tang of charcoal from the club's outdoor pit wrapped around me as I stepped into the dim parking lot. Crickets stitched the silence together, their chirping more honest than anything I'd heard at that table. I pulled out my phone thumb, brushing the small cracks on its case, and saw the notification blinking at the top of my screen. Unusual disbursements. Pension fund. The subject line alone carried more weight than Lorraine's entire proclamation. I tapped it open, the glow of the screen spilling across my hand as I leaned against the cold metal of my car. The night was still save for the hum of the security lights overhead. I didn't read past the first line just yet. I let the subject sit there bright against the dark and took a slow breath. Understood, I whispered, not to Lorraine this time, but to myself. To the bourbon air, the silent cousins, the envelope in my pocket, and the email waiting to change the shape of what comes next. The wind pushed a dry leaf across the asphalt, its brittle scrape the only sound as I unlocked my car door. I slid inside, shut the door, and let the quiet settle. Some exits don't need a slammed door or a speech. Sometimes the soft click of a lock and the glow of a single email are more than enough to mark the beginning of something else entirely. The farmhouse never used to feel this cavernous. It wasn't large by Lexington standards, just 2 stories and a wraparound porch, but without voices to fill it. Every footstep seemed to echo against the hardwood like a reminder. The late autumn wind pressed faintly at the windows, making them tremble, while the neon sign from the bourbon bar down the road pulsed through the curtains, a tired glow in red and white, blinking just enough to make the living room shadows shift. I didn't bother with the lights. I walked straight past the hall mirror, where a dusty reflection of myself lingered in the gloom, and into the study. The oak safe sat in the corner, like an old sentry, its finish dulled by years of neglect. My fingers found the cold metal of the dial, and as I turned it slow and careful, my father's voice threaded back into memory. Paper holds what blood can't. He'd said it the day we signed the trust agreement, his tone quiet but firm enough to stick all these years later. He'd never trusted handshakes and family names alone to hold a legacy together. He trusted ink. I closed my eyes for a moment, hearing him hum one of those off-key jazz tunes as he scribbled his name across that last page, and when I opened them, the safe clicked open with a sound that felt like a sigh. Inside, beneath a thin film of dust, lay the contract. The envelope was yellowed at the edges, the paper inside still thick and deliberate signatures, bold, not faded. The faint, woody cologne my father wore, something old-fashioned, from a shop that closed years ago, still clung to it as if the fibers had stored a piece of him for me to find. I lifted it carefully, brushing off a line of dust with my thumb, and set it on the desk under the soft glow of the banker's lamp. For a moment, I just stared at it, tracing the raised seal near the corner, feeling the subtle indentations of our names. In the kitchen, the microwave clock blinked 8:45. I pulled the pot roast from the fridge, still in the plastic container, and set it on the counter. Steam curled from it as I warmed it up, but by the time I sat down, fork poised, my appetite had dulled. I ate a bite, 2 at most, before pushing the plate aside. Condensation had already started to bead along its rim. The bourbon bar's sign cast a soft, red stripe across the plate, making the juice glisten in a way that only made me feel colder. I carried the rest back to the fridge untouched and returned to the study. The desk was cluttered with my laptop and a scattered pile of manila folders. I opened the laptop, the glow from the screen sharpening the dust motes drifting in the lamplight. I dug through old archives, email chains from 2017, scanned bank statements, anything that tied back to the trust. The hours ticked by, unnoticed, the neon sign outside, flickering like a lazy metronome, and the house settling with the occasional pop and creak as the temperature dropped outside. I leaned back once to stretch and noticed the bourbon smell had seeped in through the window seams, a faint sweetness undercutting the stale air. It was near midnight when my cursor froze on a scanned page I hadn't looked at in years. Section 9.4, bold and unmistakable. No disbursement, loan, or transfer of pension trust funds shall be executed without the written approval and physical signature of Malcolm A. Greer. I read it twice, the words landing like a slow drum beat. They hadn't rewritten this. They hadn't even tried. Lorraine, for all her confidence, had overlooked the one tether they couldn't cut without my hand. A faint ping from my laptop broke the moment. An email banner slid across the corner of the screen, its subject line sharp against the dim glow Bluegrass Bank. Inquiry required suspicious withdrawal activity. I sat forward, heart ticking a little quicker than before, and clicked it open. The message began with a formal greeting, but I didn't read beyond the first 2 lines. The words suspicious and withdrawal were enough to keep me there, fingers resting on the keyboard without typing a single word. Outside, the bourbon sign buzzed faintly, casting a pale wash of red across the study walls. I placed the contract back into the envelope, slid it carefully to the far corner of the desk, and watched the dust motes drift in the lamp's cone of light. The house creaked again, the wind shifting through the gutters, and I exhaled slowly. They wanted me invisible, irrelevant, erased from the table. But the paper still carried my name, my father's ink, and the one clause Lorraine could neither tear apart nor ignore. I pushed back from the desk, the chair wheels groaning, and glanced at the microwave clock again, 12:07 a.m. My untouched plate of pot roast sat back in the fridge, condensation fogging its plastic lid. I shut off the lamp and left the study, but not before my hand brushed the contract one last time. The paper was cool, real steady, more loyal than any of them had been tonight. In the hallway, the glow from the bourbon sign flickered once more before fading to black, leaving only the dim hum of the fridge and the weight of the email waiting for me to act. Sunday mornings in downtown Lexington always feel slower, even when the air bites at your ears and the streets glisten from an overnight frost. I parked across from St. Luke's, where the church bells had just finished their soft toll, and crossed the nearly empty road toward the chrome-trimmed diner that had been there since before I was born. The windows, fogged with heat from the griddle inside letters on the glass, slightly faded, but still readable, Harlan's Diner, since 1953. Inside, the smell of frying bacon and burnt toast mingled with the sweetness of syrup, the kind of scent that stuck to your clothes long after you left. Alden Rourke was already in a booth along the back wall, the one with the cracked red vinyl seat that squeaked when you sat down. He was leaning forward, hands wrapped around a coffee mug, watching the steam curl and vanish. He looked smaller than I remembered retirement, or maybe just time had rounded his shoulders and added a fine tremor to his hands. But when he glanced up at me, his eyes were steady, clear, as though he hadn't aged a day. I slid into the booth, my coat rustling, and the seat groaned beneath me. The waitress appeared, silently poured coffee into my cup, and walked away without asking what we wanted. She didn't need to. This place had its rhythm. Alden tapped a small black USB drive against the Formica tabletop. The sound was a soft click, but deliberate enough to cut through the low hum of the diner. This, he said, his voice carrying just enough weight, is the only clean copy left. And you'll need it soon. His fingers lingered on the drive before sliding it toward me. I didn't reach for it yet. Instead, I watched the reflection of the diner's neon clock flicker across its polished surface. Steam rose from my chipped mug, twisting in the air like a reminder to keep still. "Lorraine's already making moves," I said, keeping my voice low. "She thinks tearing up a copy makes the whole thing disappear." Alden's lips tightened. Not quite a smile, not quite a frown. "She's banking on noise and speed," he replied, resting his shaky hands on the edge of the table. "But paper has patience, and so should you." Outside, faint organ music drifted from the church, soft enough to feel more like memory than sound. I sipped the coffee, bitter, scalding a comfort in its own rough way, and leaned closer. So, what do I do? I could drag this to a lawyer tomorrow, but Alden cut me off with a slow shake of his head. "Let Lorraine think she's won," he said. "Let her keep parading around with her half-truths and doctored ledgers. The audit will do more damage than any shouting match. When the hammer falls, she won't see it coming." His tone wasn't vengeful. It was the measured voice of a man who had seen too many families rip themselves apart by acting too soon. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded printout, a page from the trust agreement. His finger traced the bold heading, Section 9.4. "Your father made sure this couldn't be tampered with. Even I didn't realize how airtight it was until I reread it last week." He glanced up, meeting my eyes. He trusted paper more than people. Always said handshakes were for greetings, not agreements. The waitress came back with a refill, sliding the carafe across the table wordlessly. The steam from both our mugs curled together for a brief second before fading. Alden finally pushed the USB drive all the way across to me. I picked it up, feeling its slight weight in my palm, heavier than something that size had any right to be. "When the time comes," he murmured, patting my shoulder, with a hand that trembled but still carried authority. "Don't blink. They'll try to scare you into folding. Remember what's written, not what's said." The organ across the street faded into silence as service began, the bells marking the hour again. I slipped the USB into my coat pocket beside the envelope that had been riding there since the country club dinner. 2 anchors, one in paper, one in plastic, both holding more than anyone in the family suspected. The coffee had gone cold, but I drained it anyway, more for the warmth than the taste. As I slid out of the booth, my phone buzzed. A single text lit the screen. Lorraine's name at the top, her words as clipped as ever. "Bring me all pension files by Friday. No excuses." I stared at it for a moment, the neon light from the diner's sign bleeding across the screen, then slipped the phone back into my pocket. The air outside was colder now, the kind that cut through your coat no matter how thick it was. I pulled my collar up, USB and envelope pressing against my chest, and walked toward my car as the church doors opened across the street, releasing a murmur of voices into the brittle winter morning. The boardroom at Greer Distilleries always smelled faintly of whiskey, even after the nightly cleaning crew had finished scrubbing the carpets and polishing the brass fixtures. On this early spring afternoon, that warmth clashed with the sharper tang of printer toner, the scent clinging to the air like a quiet warning. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, streaking the oak-paneled walls, and catching on the frame of our father's portrait above the head chair. His eyes, rendered in careful brushstrokes, watched the room with the same level gaze he used to give us when he was alive, steady, unblinking, unamused by theatrics, which made what Lorraine did next feel almost sacrilegious. With a smirk sharp enough to slice the quiet, she held up a photocopy of the pension trust contract, the same one she believed symbolized my fading relevance. Her nails, perfectly lacquered, pinched the edges, as she said almost playfully, "You and your little signatures, relics of another time." Then, with a practiced flick, she tore it in half. The rip was louder than it should have been, the sound bouncing off the wood and brass making both junior executives in the corner flinch. Lorraine let the pieces fall into the waste bin beside her chair, dusted her hands lightly, and leaned back as though she'd just cleared clutter from the room rather than shredded a legal record. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Instead, I let my gaze drift to the side table, where a neat stack of invoices sat beside the laser printer. The top few pages were marred with streaks, the kind you only get when someone has been a little too liberal with whiteout before recopying figures. Numbers blurred, dates softened into smudges that still showed the ghosts of what they'd been before. My fingers stayed still in my lap, but my eyes traced every one of those imperfections, cataloging them like beads on a string. Lorraine's voice filled the space again, all sugar with a core of steel. "Production losses aren't the end of the world," she said, gesturing vaguely to the window, as if the bright day outside could back her up. "I've got it under control. The fund's there to absorb shocks like this. That's what Dad wanted, isn't it? Stability." Her gaze landed on me, that half smile widening. "Unless you think your signature on a piece of paper matters more than keeping our barrels full and the lights on." I kept my face, neutral eyes steady on the invoices, and finally leaned forward just enough to retrieve my phone from the table. As Lorraine turned back to the junior executives who were exchanging glances, one biting his lip, the other staring at his shoes, I angled the phone slightly, snapping 2 quiet photos of the stack. The soft click of the camera shutter was masked by the buzz of the printer warming up for another job. I slid the phone back into my pocket thumb, brushing against the smooth edge of the USB Alden had given me just days before. Lorraine stood smoothing the front of her tailored jacket. "We're done here. Malcolm, I suggest you find something else to do with your time besides clinging to paperwork. Leave the heavy lifting to people who can handle pressure." She swept up her notes, her heels clicking on the hardwood as she moved toward the door, the junior executives scrambling to follow. One of them looked back at me, briefly. A flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but said nothing. The door shut with a muted thud, and I was alone with the faint hum of the printer and the ghost of that tearing sound still hanging in the air. I pulled my phone out again and opened a blank text thread. My thumbs hovered over the keys for a moment before I typed 3 words, audit trigger pulled. I hit send. No greeting, no signature. Alden would understand. The man has never needed more than a sentence to know the score. As I stood, the room seemed to stretch in the quiet. The smell of whiskey felt heavier now, as if the portrait of our father was breathing it down. Sunlight shifted, catching on the rim of the waste bin where the shredded copy rested. I didn't bother retrieving it. It wasn't worth the effort, not when the original contract was still locked away in my safe, untouched, unchallenged, a silent ace, waiting for the right moment. Sliding my phone into my pocket, I glanced at the wall clock. The ticking was almost louder than the faint whir of the printer cooling down. Just as I reached for the doorknob, my phone buzzed again, this time with a calendar alert, lighting up the screen in a stark white box, Bluegrass Audit Review. 2 days. I let the screen glow for a moment, the reflection casting a pale light on my palm before turning it off and pocketing it. Outside the boardroom, footsteps and muted chatter drifted down the hall, but none of it touched me. The next 48 hours would, and that was enough to keep my steps measured as I left the room, letting the heavy door click shut behind me. The fluorescent lights in the Greer Distillery's boardroom always made the place feel more like a doctor's office than the heart of a whiskey empire. Their hum was constant, steady, the kind of sound you stopped hearing until the room went quiet enough for it to get under your skin. This morning, as the humidity from the Kentucky summer bled in through the old windows, the hum felt louder than usual. I laid a stack of printed emails on the table, the edges rough beneath my fingertips, and let the pages settle with a soft thud that broke the silence. Lorraine sat 2 seats down, her smile a brittle mask. She tapped her nails against the wood, each click timed to my movements, as though she could drown out the sound of what I was placing in front of everyone. The board members, our cousins, an uncle or two, one aunt, whose only qualification was her last name, shifted in their chairs, eyes darting between the pages and the old clock on the wall. The company lawyer stood by the windows, arms folded, gaze fixed on me like he was waiting to see how deep I intended to cut. "Here's what we're looking at," I said, my voice low, but carrying. I tapped the top page where the screenshots showed time-stamped email threads between Lorraine and a junior accountant discussing transfers out of the pension fund. Dated, documented, no guesswork. Multiple withdrawals over the past 6 weeks, none of which bear my approval. Clause 9.4 requires my signature on any transaction involving these funds. That hasn't happened. Lorraine's fingers stilled. "Malcolm," she began, voice sweetened with that tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable but had run out of patience. "You're reading these out of context. These are temporary reallocations, internal solutions. Dad wanted flexibility. Dad also wanted his contracts honored." I cut in, keeping my tone flat, not rising. "And the clause exists for a reason. These weren't approved and the signatures aren't mine. For everyone's protection, yours, mine, the company's, I'm requesting a third-party audit, independent, neutral, binding." The room held still for a moment, save for the faint rattle of a loose blind against the window frame. One of the older board members cleared his throat, eyes flicking to the lawyer, then back to Lorraine. No one wanted to say what we were all thinking. No one wanted to be the first to fracture the illusion of control Lorraine had been coasting on since spring. I kept my jacket buttoned, feeling the stiff corner of the original trust contract pressed against my ribs. I didn't pull it out. Not yet. Its presence was enough to keep my breathing even, to remind me that this conversation wasn't my last line of defense, just the opening move. "An audit," one of the cousins finally asked, his voice catching on the last syllable. "Won't that make things look bad to the banks?" His eyes darted nervously toward Lorraine, whose smile had thinned to something almost translucent. "It'll make things look honest," I said, turning just enough to meet his gaze without flinching. "The numbers will stand or fall on their own, but I'm not signing off on any more transfers until an independent review is done." The lawyer, silent until now, nodded once, almost imperceptibly. It was enough. One by one, the board members raised their hands. The vote wasn't dramatic, no arguments or shouting, just quiet hands in the humid air, a count that ended with no dissent. Lorraine's nails started tapping again, quicker this time, a staccato beat that betrayed the calm she was trying to project. When the motion carried, the lawyer collected the pages, slid them into a folder, and said, "I'll initiate the process immediately." The scrape of his chair echoed as he stood. The board members followed, murmurs rising like a timid tide, eager to leave the charged air behind. Lorraine remained seated until the room had mostly emptied, her posture perfectly straight, her expression a mask pulled tight over whatever storm was brewing beneath. I gathered my papers, sliding them into a neat stack, and stood. That's when Lorraine leaned toward me, her perfume sharp against the stale humidity, and whispered, just for me, "You'll regret this before week's end." Her breath was warm, her voice cold enough to frost the windows. I met her eyes for a moment, long enough to see the tension hiding in the corners, and then turned, without a word. The hum of the lights filled the silence again as I stepped toward the door. My hand brushed against the envelope in my jacket pocket, the original trust contract still sealed, still waiting. The weight of it was steady, a silent counterbalance to Lorraine's threat. Out in the hallway, the air felt thicker, the building's old ducts pushing lukewarm air that smelled faintly of oak barrels from the warehouse below. I exhaled slowly, loosening my tie as I walked, and glanced at my phone. No new messages, No calls, just the soft glow of the calendar icon, a silent reminder of what lay ahead. 2 more days until the audit began. 2 days for Lorraine to make good on her warning, or to dig herself in, deeper trying. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and pushed through the heavy door at the end of the corridor. The summer air outside hit me like a damp cloth, but it felt cleaner somehow than the stagnant tension I'd left behind. Some battles don't need shouting or fists. Sometimes they just need paper patience and the right fluorescent-lit room. The call came just as I was finishing my second cup of coffee, the kind that had gone lukewarm because I'd been staring out the kitchen window longer than I realized. Bluegrass Bank's number lit up my phone, and when I answered, the voice on the other end was clipped polite and cold as the porcelain mug in my hand.
Mr. Greer, we've suspended Greer Distillery's credit line pending the outcome of the audit. No exceptions. Please ensure compliance by close of business today. The line clicked dead before I could reply. I stared at the steamless swirl of coffee in my mug, then set it down on the counter and called Alden. His voice came through the speaker, steady, despite the faint tremor age had etched into it. Clause 9.4, he said without preamble, his words wrapped in a sigh that might have been relief, is about to earn its keep. Bring the original. Don't let Lorraine improvise her way through this one. By the time I reached the corporate finance office, the sky over Lexington had turned the color of old pewter. A summer storm rattled the blinds against the windows, each gust a hollow drumbeat against the glass. The overhead lights were harsh, bleaching everyone's faces into a shared shade of worry. Lorraine paced near the conference table, a folder clutched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. A bead of sweat slipped from her temple down to her jaw as she barked into her phone, her voice rising with every sentence. Drew, our cousin, and the acting CEO sat near the end of the table, pale and slack-shouldered fingers hooked nervously around his tie as if it were a lifeline. The speakerphone in the center of the table crackled. We need confirmation of fund control and a valid original trust document to reinstate credit, the bank representative said, each word measured. Until then, all draws are on hold. The silence that followed was long enough to hear the storm's low growl outside and the faint drip of water hitting the eaves just beyond the window. Lorraine turned toward me, desperation bleeding through the cracks in her composure. Malcolm, tell them we're fine. Tell them you've approved the transfers. Or just sign off now so we can get the line back. Her hand extended toward me, not quite pleading, but not far from it. Fingers trembling around the edges of the folder she held. I kept my expression still, my jacket buttoned, feeling the stiff weight of the envelope beneath the fabric. I stepped forward, each footfall sounding louder than it should in the cavernous room. I haven't approved a thing, I said, calm enough to steady Drew, whose hands had begun to fidget. But I can, if the original terms are respected. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the envelope, its seal unbroken, the paper inside, as pristine as the day my father and I signed it. For a moment, all eyes locked on the cream-colored rectangle as if it were more artifact than document. I placed it on the table beside the speakerphone, sliding it toward the center. This is the governing agreement. Clause 9.4 is intact. I'll co-sign to stabilize operations, but no further withdrawals move forward without adherence to this contract. Period. Drew let out a breath that sounded like he'd been holding it for a week. Thank God, he murmured, sitting up straighter, relief softening the tightness around his eyes. Lorraine, on the other hand, froze in place, her folder slipping slightly in her grip. You're doing this now. Siding with. She stopped herself, glancing toward the speaker, perhaps realizing how her words would sound if anyone from the bank heard them.
The bank rep's voice broke the moment. With Mr. Greer's co-signature, we'll release the hold by end of day. Pending full audit results, of course. The line clicked off, leaving only the hum of the storm and the overhead lights filling the silence. Drew straightened his tone, cautious but firm. Lorraine, I think it's best if you step back. Temporarily. His eyes slid toward me for confirmation. I didn't nod. I didn't need to. The decision was already floating in the stale air, as tangible as the contract between us. The resignation paperwork was printed and signed within the hour. No one spoke, while the pen scratched across the pages, not even Lorraine, who kept her gaze fixed on the oak grain of the table as she wrote her name. The only sounds were the distant roll of thunder and the steady tap of rain against the window. When the last page was signed and slid into its folder, Drew exhaled again, softer this time, and extended his hand to me. I shook it once, brief and firm. By the time I stepped outside, the rain had softened to a mist, droplets clinging to the carved oak sign at the front of the building. Greer. Distilleries. The letters read slick with water, but solid, as if to remind me that the company was more than the storm it had just weathered. I stood there for a moment, coat collar turned up against the wind, and let the damp air settle on my skin. The envelope with the contract rested in my inner pocket, warm now from my body heat, the edges pressing lightly against my chest. I looked at the sign one last time, the rain beating and rolling off its surface, and wondered, not for the first time, what my father would have thought if he could see this. The storm, the silence, the way his careful ink was still holding the family together even when we barely could. A gust of wind sent the blinds inside rattling again, muffled through the thick windows. I turned toward my car, the contract secure, and walked into the gray, steady drizzle, letting the questions linger without expecting answers. The law office was quiet in the way only expensive spaces can be: thick glass soft carpet and the low hum of a ventilation system so subtle you forget it's there until it stops. Autumn sunlight angled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, spilling across the polished conference table and tracing the edges of a ceramic coffee cup that had caught my eye the moment I sat down. Its crack had been mended with a thin seam of gold lacquer, the repair deliberate and visible, as if to make the flaw part of its beauty instead of something to hide. It sat on the desk beside the stack of papers, waiting for my hand steam, curling lazily from the coffee inside. My hand trembled as I uncapped the pen. Not a full shake, just enough to make me pause before pressing the tip to paper. Alden stood to my right. His frame reflected in the window shoulders a little more stooped than last year, but still carrying that steady weight he always had when things were about to tip one way or the other. The neutral attorney sat across from us, hands folded, saying nothing as the light glinted off his watch. In the distance through the glass, I could see the tree-lined street shifting with the breeze leaves just beginning to take on their fall colors. The city felt softer from up here. I leaned forward, exhaling slowly, and placed my signature on the first page of the restructured trust agreement. The pen scratched softly, the sound blending with the faint hum of the air system. My name in ink again this time, not just as a gatekeeper, but as a steward. I flipped to the next page, each sheet carrying the weight of everything the last 2 years had ground through the audit Lorraine's departure, the nights spent combing through clauses like lifelines. My hand steadied as I signed the next few lines. By the 4th page, the tremor was gone. When the final signature was in place, I set the pen down and pushed the stack forward. The attorney reached for the notary seal, pressing it to the corner of the top page. The stamp's quiet thud carried more finality than any gavel or argument ever could. A small puff of gold ink spread under the translucent paper, catching the sunlight just enough to make it shimmer. Alden's hand settled on my shoulder, his grip firm but warm.
Your father would have liked this,
He murmured, his voice a low rasp, softened by approval. I didn't answer right away. I just let the words settle like dust in the light before nodding once. The attorney slid the completed agreement into a folder and placed it neatly at the edge of the table.
It's done,
He said, his voice more a formality than an announcement. I turned toward Alden. From here, I said 10% of annual profits will go into the Greer-Rourke Scholarship Fund. Kids who grew up around these warehouses, the ones who stacked boxes and swept floors, they deserve a hand up, not just a handshake. Alden's nod deepened, his mouth curving into the kind of faint smile I hadn't seen from him in years. The gold seam in the coffee cup on the desk caught another flare of sunlight, and I reached for it almost without thinking. The ceramic was warm in my palm, the heat bleeding through to my fingers as I lifted it. The repaired crack gleamed faintly, not hidden, not perfect, but stronger for the mending. I brought the cup closer, the aroma of dark roast grounding me, and whispered to no one in particular. Fixed at last. The words felt less like a declaration and more like a release, a small exhale of weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. The attorney began gathering his things. Alden turned toward the window, and I stayed seated for a moment longer, cradling the cup. The city outside moved on, cars sliding through the intersection leaves, spinning lazily in the wind, a cyclist coasting down the slight slope of Main Street. But up here, the air felt still held together by paper ink and a repaired cup that now felt more like mine than the signature I'd just written. The autumn sun drifted through the banners lining Lexington's Civic Square, warming the cobblestones beneath my shoes as I stepped onto the modest wooden stage. A soft breeze teased the edges of the scholarship announcement papers in my hand, and somewhere behind the crowd, a local bluegrass band plucked a slow, easy tune. The sound carried across the square, weaving between the stalls where vendors sold cider and warm biscuits. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and wood smoke, a gentler kind of Kentucky than the one I'd been living in for the past few years. On the lectern before me, I set the ceramic coffee cup. Its repaired seam, a thin line of gold, caught the sunlight and glowed for a moment like a deliberate reminder. I didn't drink from it yet. Just seeing it there whole but honest about where it had been broken steadied me more than the speech I'd written. My thumb smoothed the edge of the papers, the texture of the embossed letterhead grounding me. The microphone squealed softly, then settled. Faces looked up, some curious others, smiling politely, a few with the kind of bright eagerness only youth can bring. My father built a business with barrels ledgers and an unshakable belief in doing things by the book. I began, my voice calm, carrying without strain. Today, we're adding a new page to that book. The Greer-Rourke Scholarship Fund will provide opportunities for young people in this city, the ones who've worked in warehouses, who've mopped floors and stacked crates, and who've dreamed of something beyond what's in front of them. I paused, letting the words sit in the cool autumn air. This fund is for them. It's for what comes next. A ripple of applause moved through the audience, polite but genuine. Toward the edge of the crowd, a local reporter lowered her camera and raised her hand. "What about Lorraine?" she asked, voice carrying just enough to be heard. "Where does she fit into this future?" The question didn't sting. Not anymore. I let a breath out through my nose, something close to a smile tugging at my mouth. Family names fade, I said evenly, resting my hand on the cool rim of the coffee cup, but signed promises last. I didn't elaborate. There was nothing more to say. The words hung there for a moment, caught by the breeze like the scent of the cider, before I stepped back from the lectern. The applause swelled again as I descended the steps, but I didn't wait for the handshakes or the photo opportunities. The bluegrass band shifted into a livelier tune as I crossed the square, the sound fading with each step until it was just a faint hum behind me. I found a small cafe tucked along the edge of the square, its windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside. The bell above the door chimed as I entered, and the scent of roasted beans wrapped around me like a familiar coat. I took a corner table by the window, away from the chatter, and pulled the cup from my satchel. The gold seam caught the low afternoon light now, subtler than before, but no less steady. I filled it with the house brew, the steam curling upward in delicate wisps that seemed to slow the rest of the world down. Outside, people wandered between the market stalls, their laughter rising and falling like the breeze. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve near a cider stand, pointing toward the music, his voice too soft to reach me, but enough to shift the mood of the square. As I lifted the cup, the heat seeped into my fingers, a steadying warmth. I watched the steam rise, twisting and fading, just as the tension in my shoulders began to ease. The cafe's hanging sign creaked softly in the wind, the faint rattle against its chain, more soothing than any applause had been. I sipped slowly the coffee dark and smooth and let the moment stretch. The banners in the square rippled gently. The music ebbed, and the last traces of the weight I'd been carrying since that night at the country club seemed to lift with the steam drifting from my cup. There was no triumph in it, no grand vindication. Just a quiet closing of one chapter, the kind that doesn't need headlines or family approval. Outside the window, a gust of wind sent a swirl of orange leaves spinning across the square. I leaned back, let the warmth of the cup linger in my hands, and watched the world move on without me needing to steer it. The gold seam in my old coffee cup glimmered softly as dusk settled over the square, the last warmth of the day clinging to my hands. In that small repaired thing, I felt the echo of what the past 2 years had broken and what patience had managed to mend. I learned that justice doesn't always roar. It can arrive quietly with a pen stroke and a promise kept. Sometimes bridges have to collapse so we know which ones are worth rebuilding. And even when family ties fray, there's always another way to build something lasting. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise?